All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are jumping into a really fascinating hypothesis about one of the most famous figures in all of history. And we're going to look at a new theory that tries to fill in a major mysterious gap in his life story.
So you know the story, right? The Gospels tell us about his birth, and then they tell us all about his public ministry. But there is this massive, silent gap right in the middle. From the time he's a kid in the temple to when he shows up as a man at his baptism, the story just stops cold.
For 18 solid years, the record just goes silent. And you better believe this has led to centuries of speculation. I mean, we're talking theories that range from the totally ordinary to the completely wild. But what if this period wasn't lost at all? What if it was just hidden?
Okay, let's really dive into this theory. There's an academic paper out there that proposes this wasn't some lost weekend. Instead, it was a time of incredibly intense, deliberate preparation, a kind of spiritual apprenticeship that actually shaped everything that came next. So here's the core idea, the thesis of the whole thing, that Jesus went through a period of what the paper calls intentional formation. The idea is that he was grounding himself in these ancient spiritual practices long before his public life ever kicked off. This wasn't an accident, it was a plan.
So what would a plan like that even look like? What's the framework for this formation? Well, the hypothesis zeroes in on an ancient, really powerful practice known as the Nazirite vow.
Now, the Nazirite vow is honestly super interesting because it was a visible public sign of a special kind of dedication. It involved these really specific things, like not drinking wine, not cutting your hair, that would set you apart for a while, all for a spiritual purpose.
And this right here, this is an absolutely crucial distinction. This was not a law that everyone had to follow. It was a personal, voluntary choice. The theory suggests Jesus was modeling a different kind of freedom, one that's found not in just doing whatever you feel like, but in freely choosing to bind your freedom to a higher purpose.
All right, so the vow is the foundation, right? But the hypothesis argues that this whole period was built on more than that. It identifies three interlocking practices that really would have defined this formative time.
So you've got the vow itself, and that provides the structure. Then you add to that a deep, disciplined study of the scriptures. And finally, you layer on travel, actually getting out and experiencing the wider world. You see how those three things together would have formed a complete spiritual and practical education?
And when we say study of the Torah, we're not talking about just passively reading scrolls. The paper suggests this was active. It was embodied. It meant actually writing or copying scripture, meditating on it out loud every single day, and really cultivating a genuine, joyful delight in it. This could totally explain the incredible scriptural authority he had later on. And I think this is a brilliant idea. Travel would have served a very specific purpose. This wasn't just tourism, you know. The paper calls it an anthropological apprenticeship. It was a way to observe different cultures, to understand the very people he was about to engage with, which helped him craft a message that could resonate with everyone.
Okay, so here's where it all comes together. The crucial point is seeing how this whole period of preparation connects directly to his public ministry. The theory argues that nothing he did later was random. It was all rooted in this deep, intentional formation.
To get what they're saying, the paper points back to the historical era of the Judges, which was a time of social and spiritual chaos. It's summed up perfectly by this famous line, a time when, without a central moral compass, society just started to fall apart.
So with that historical background in mind, his ministry suddenly looks like a direct prophetic response to that kind of broken system. His formation prepared him to be what the paper calls a formed corrector. And so actions like cleansing the temple, they aren't just seen as random outbursts of anger, but as deliberate symbolic acts to restore integrity. Theologically, this gets pretty deep. The paper connects his entire life to this ancient concept of the whole burnt offering. Now, this was a specific type of sacrifice that symbolized total, unblemished, undivided devotion. The idea then is that his hidden years of formation were preparing him to live out this ideal of complete self-giving. Okay, so why are we talking about this now? What does any of this ancient practice matter today? Well, the paper argues that these patterns of devotion and disciplined practice actually keep echoing in some very surprising modern movements.
I mean, for example, some Rastafari communities embrace vows that look a lot like the Nazirite vow, with the uncut hair and in specific diets. Or think about the way many spiritual communities use songs and chants to really internalize sacred texts. That's basically a modern way of creating a personal Torah. The core ideas are absolutely still alive and kicking.
And that really brings us to the big takeaway here. This ancient model directly challenges a very modern assumption we have.
It suggests that real, meaningful freedom isn't the license to do whatever you want, but the liberty you have to dedicate that freedom to a higher, consecrated purpose.
And that leaves us with a pretty big question to chew on. In a culture that prizes absolute individual autonomy, maybe above all else, what could it possibly look like for us to voluntarily bind our freedom to something we consider holy? What's the relationship between discipline and liberty in our own lives?